Good morning. A lot of folks have reached out to me to ask me what I thought about the Supreme Court recently striking down affirmative action nationwide. And I wanted to offer a slightly different perspective, but also a bit of a reality check. Check this out. I live in Washington State. Washington State has not had affirmative action in 25 years, since 1998. And it was not struck down by 9 people on the court, but instead was overwhelmingly voted down by the vast majority of voters in Washington State, specifically white voters. And here's the reality check part. It wasn't just conservative voters. So before we start saying that the Supreme Court is out of touch or they're renegade, understand that their views are consistent with the majority of white voters in America who do not want affirmative action. Peace.
So, hey guys. So, this is true. Giassi is 100% correct. The polls are very clear that majorities of Americans, particularly independents, obviously Republicans, but I think if you broke it down by race, I think it would be very clear as well that there isn't a ton of support for affirmative action, because I think for a lot in America, among the American populace outside of black and brown folks. And the reason for that is that I think for a lot of white Americans, educational opportunity is a zero-sum game. Every time a black or a brown person or an indigenous person gets an opportunity, a lot of white Americans view that as opportunity stolen from them. Because I think there's, for such a long time, been a kind of sense of entitlement to the finest education that money can buy in America, and they've been able to have it. And so this idea is that folks don't accept that when a black or a brown person gets admitted to an elite school, a Harvard, a Yale, a Brown, or whatever, that they earn that spot. There's this sense that, well, they must have taken that from my child, from me, from my family. And so that zero-sum attitude, I think, has poisoned a lot of white Americans against affirmative action. But here's the thing that's so crazy about that. The statistics show that 43% of white students who get into top colleges, and let's just Harvard, for instance, 43% of white Harvard students are either legacies, meaning they have a family member that went there, or employees of, children of employees at the school. So they have a family member that's a professor there, or some other employee or an administrator, or they're athletes. So for white Americans, if your kid did not get into the school of their choice, and that's true across many, many universities. I mean, some of these schools are letting in almost half of the legacy students who apply. So if your kid didn't get in, the reality of that is their spot. First of all, they're not entitled to a spot. No school has to let anybody in. But the spot you think is theirs was more likely taken by a legacy student, by a student who got in not because of their grades or because of merit, but because of a family connection to the school, or because they were an athlete and schools actively recruit in order to have their athletic teams do well. At Harvard, if you are a rower, if you row crew, you're getting in. If you play baseball, certain sports, you're getting in because they want to fill out those teams. So you need to think about that. And then the other thing is, you have to look beyond just your SAT scores and grades. What was in your essay? What story did you tell? There is an art to getting into these schools. And I say that as somebody who got into a bunch of them. Yale, Brown, Harvard, Vassar, Denver University. My essays were bomb, as were my grades, and as were my SAT scores and AP scores. It's a package. And it just might be that in some cases, black and brown students wrote a better essay than your kid. Black or brown students had a more interesting story to tell than your kid. They told their story in a more interesting way. So rather than look at them and say, well, why did they get what my child was entitled to? Sometimes you have to look at how you played the game, and not always blame black people and brown people for everything that doesn't go the way you want it to go. And it's a tough thing for a lot of Americans, white Americans, who've been so accustomed to getting and having privilege and getting whatever it is they want and feeling entitled to get what they want all the time. It's a hard thing to break out of when you have continual privilege. Not getting what you want or not getting to do what you want. It's why the mask thing freaked out so many people. Not being able to do whatever you want, whenever you want, however you want, suddenly feels like oppression. And other people getting opportunity suddenly feels like oppression and zero-sum oppression. And I'll say one last thing. I reread today the Supreme Court decision in the affirmative action case. And it literally reads like a Rush Limbaugh episode. This sense of anger at black people specifically for daring to be in these elite schools. The sense, Clarence Thomas literally in the same argument made an argument that black students were inherently poised to do more poorly at elite institutions because they weren't ready to be there. And then in the same argument argued that you can't stereotype people by race. Like, he made both those arguments in his same concurrence. So both black students are inferior and can't do as well in these schools, and also you can't judge people because they're black and stereotype them. He did that himself. The arguments are incoherent and they're mean, but they also just sound like the entire right. They just sound like everything Republicans always say. And what they boil down to is that they have decided that the purpose of the Supreme Court is to protect white people, and specifically white conservative Christians, and that they believe they're the only people deserving of the protection of law. And black people can go to hell. Gay people can go to hell. Women can go to hell. Latinos can go to hell. Muslims can go to hell. And this court, these 6 people, are going to do everything they can. And I include Clarence Thomas in that, because he is Stephen and Django Unchained. They're just going to do everything they can to protect white privilege, because that, in their mind, is their sole purpose for being on that court. White, conservative, Christian privilege. And everybody else in this country can go to hell. And the last thing I will say, I spoke to Sherilyn Ifill, interviewed her on the show today, and what is also clear is that the most racist elements in our society, including elected officials and people who are not lawyers but run like legal sounding organizations, are now watching colleges and vowing revenge if they don't see those black numbers fall. They're now going to judge these colleges' compliance with the Supreme Court ruling by how white they become. And if they don't become whiter, meaning they specifically don't purge black people, they're threatening to sue them again. See what you're seeing. This is pure anti-blackness. It's a hatred, an anger toward, it's literal hatred of black people. That's all it is. And, Latinos get caught up in it because they hate y'all too. And don't think if you're Asian American that they love you, because they'll get around to you next when they think there are too many of you in the room. This is a culture war, but it's also a war very specifically in this country about race. And one party has declared itself to be the white conservative Christian interests party, and they are making war on everybody else. Stay woke.